There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that will lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of the comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. So are you ready for that next level of promotion, but you're not really getting the success you're looking for, and you don't really know what's holding you back? Well, that's our subject for today. There are 6 key blind spots that are likely to be the source of your challenges. We're going to focus on what they are, how do you recognize which one applies to you, and more importantly, what do you do about each of them? So my guest today is Martin Dubin. He's a clinical psychologist, serial entrepreneur, business coach, and advisor to C-suite executives and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. He's founded several companies, including a multi-million-dollar healthcare company where he was CEO. He was a former partner at the talent firm RHR International, working with hundreds of C-suite executives and entrepreneurs, venture capital firms. And his book we're talking about, Blind Spotting, How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. So Marty, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Wanda. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. I want to start with a little bit of a personal story. So in the course of writing this book or thinking about this book, I want to know about an insight or an experience you had that tells us a little bit more about you.
Oh, lovely. Great place to start. So as you mentioned, I talked about 6 blind spots. One of them is identity. And as I was writing the book, I had this real insight about how I had an identity blind spot. And when you mentioned I was the CEO of our company, and our company managed the mental health, behavioral health benefits for large insurance companies. And we would bid on a contract based on their past history of expense, and then we would manage all the care. Well, we had a new contract, and a very large one, and we realized after about 5 months we were losing money month after month, and it was would have been an existential problem if we didn't get it fixed. And we did end up fixing it, and that's a whole nother story. But in looking back on it, I was thinking the problem happened because they had given us some bad historical data. And at the time, I thought that was the source of the problem. It was their fault, and we just needed to get it fixed. But looking back on it, I thought, why did I sign the contract? Why did I not know that the data was bad? I was a CEO. And in thinking about it, I realized, and this was really true the whole time I was running the company, I'd started out as a psychotherapist in a private practice and got into this business. And my identity was really still as a psychologist. It was a psychologist with a business. And granted, I'd done a good job. We'd grown a lot, 50 million in revenue, but I think I was not thinking that I was a business person. I was a CEO. That was my identity. And I just happened to have psychological knowledge that helped with that. And it caused me probably to filter in and filter out certain things. And in looking back, I just didn't pay as much attention as I think if I would have been fully embracing the role as a CEO that I would have.
Boy, could that question apply to so many people I see. Is your identity around the expertise that you hold, or is your identity around the leading of the team, or is your identity around leading the enterprise? I mean, those are just like 3 basic questions, but we could go 101 directions on that one. I love that. What a great story. And what's interesting is you fixed the problem, Marty, but you didn't quite realize what the blind spot was until you were doing the work on the book. So great story. All right. So tell us why you called it blind spotting and why that's such an important idea.
Yeah. First off, I had a very long, complicated title, I think, for a long time, but I did come up with the term blind spotting, and it really fits because what it's about is we have a default personality, default way of responding, learned behaviors that work for us most all the time. Blind spotting is about those times when we're not aware that our usual way of responding isn't the most appropriate for the situation, that it isn't really the way to solve the problem. And so blind spotting really is about self-awareness, being aware of your personality, your default responses, so that you can be more decisive about how you show up.
Right. The other day, so we're going to talk about this in terms of how does an individual recognize their own blind spots and take actions on it. But one thing that fascinates me about the book comes from a conversation I had just last week with a client. So I'm doing the wrap up of a program I've been running for them for 9 months. I have a bunch of people in the room, all of which are doing a fabulous job of leading a modest team. They're in the mid-levels of their career. And one of them said to me, okay, so I know I'm supposed to be giving feedback, but what should I be giving feedback on to my team? Like, what do you see are the big things that team members need to really focus on beyond the technical components? And what strikes me in your book is it's relevant for me as an individual, but it's also relevant for me as a manager. How do I say to somebody, here's a blind spot that I think you need to focus on, and here's what you can do about it?
Yeah. The genesis of really writing the book was this varied career I had. First as a psychotherapist, helping patients change, then in business, and then as a coach, helping leaders make changes. And I really realized that the changes really are about behavior. I have a model that I think we're going to talk about the 6 blind spots, but all the blind spots show up in our behavior. I mean, that's who we are, and that's what people experience. And actually, so helping somebody change is talking about their behavior, not talking about some conceptual sense of who they are or a trait or something, because it's like hard to get your arms around that. The key, though, is figuring out what's an important enough behavior that it really is a meaningful enough change. But the good part about it is they're very small changes that can have huge impact. And I give the example of, coaching comes from sports, and the more elite the athlete is, the more coaching they get. And the coaching they get is about small changes, shift your weight a little bit this way or that, or grip the golf club a little differently. And so that's what it's about. It would be managers thinking about what are the small behavioral changes that really will make that person show up in a different way.
Yeah, if we could ever get managers to that point of view, the coaching profession as a separate profession might actually disappear. And I'm not holding my breath for that one. All right, 6 blind spots. Explain each one of them and kind of give me an example of each one.
Sure. So I came up with the 6, but the hardest work, quite frankly, of the book was kind of putting them together in a model. So for your listeners, the model is, just think of almost like a target with 3, a circle in the middle and then 2 circles around it. And the outside circle is what we're most aware of and where the change can happen. And that's behavior, as I already mentioned, and identity. So behavior is just that. It's how we show up. It's the description of how we're showing up. Identity are the name tags we wear. And, we have a lot of them, but there's some core ones, and some never change, gender identity, where our birth order was, our parents, those kinds of things. But through life, we put new identities on and take them off. At some time you weren't a parent and then you became a parent. That's a new identity and a very important one. So my example in the beginning, thinking about the identity and your role is really important. So those are 2 on the outside rim. Then the next section has got 3 that are harder to become aware of and that are more fixed, quite frankly. So they are harder to change. You can change, again, the behavior and identity, how they show up. And these 3 are our traits, our intellect, and our emotions. And just real quickly, the emotions are very much similar to what your listeners are familiar with from EQ research and writing. But the one difference I really make with that is all of that awareness about your emotion is so that you can be decisive about how you show up with your emotions, how you use your emotions in a very deliberate way. And we can talk about that later, but that's the emotion part. The trait part is probably the most familiar to your listeners because that's what most leadership books and articles talk about. What are the leadership traits of a particular job or role? And so those are adjectives that we use to describe ourselves. And intellect, I just became aware in my practice with leaders that it isn't just about who's smartest in the room. Clearly, that kind of IQ horsepower I talk about is very important. But I talk in the book about 3 other kinds of intelligence as also being very critical, especially for a team to have all of these to really solve problems better. And the 2 other areas that I talk about in that chapter are about how you acquire knowledge. And especially how you deal with the blind zone of how do you know what you don't know. And then the last one is a strategic thinking. What is that, and how does that show up? And then the very final of the sixth blind spot is in the center of the target, and that's our motive. That's what drives us. That's the engine in the system. That's the why of why do we do things.
Okay. All right. So I've got identity and behavior. I've got traits, intellect, emotions, and I've got my motives, which is my internal part. Okay. Now, let me go back to intellect, because you said that there are four kinds of intellect. We know the IQ, so I guess we often say the raw brain power, but I'm not so sure that's true. Maybe we want to say the computing power, the ability to acquire information. What are the other three? Just say the other three again.
Sure. And this, I'll admit, this is a very experimental chapter, if you will.
That's okay.
More of observation. So I think there is that horsepower, people that can just crunch a lot of information, think about a lot, hold a lot of information, analyze well. And then there's speed of processing. Some people are just so fast in the moment. I saw this in my work with venture capitalists. They're just remarkable. The decision trees just click, 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 click. And they're different than that horsepower one, where the horsepower person might say, well, I need to think about that a little more. Let me go back to my spreadsheet to figure it out, where the speed of processing person has just got an answer right there and can work on that. And those people are great in negotiations, obviously, to write on the spot. The other one, another one is creative intellect. These are often the people on the team that are making connections that other people don't see. They can be kind of annoying. They bring up something. The leader might say, why are you talking about that? That's not the subject matter. But the astute leader will recognize that even if that person doesn't know what the connection is, that they're probably at some intuitive level recognizing the connection. And often those are keys that unlock problems. And so helping that creative person articulate their process. And then there's what I would call street savvy. And these are people kind of head on a pivot. They're just paying attention to everything, very high in the emotional intelligence part, but just aware of lots and lots of information, lots of situations. And they may not have done that well in school, but that's the person you want, on a hike in the mountains or whatever, that they're the great problem solvers. And so I think teams and good leaders surround themselves with people that make up all of these, and the leader knowing where they're good, where their strengths are, and where their flat spots are.
Yeah, I know the theories from various psychologists of prior years of all the different kinds of intelligence we have. But I have to say I like your four in particular, because they ring true to me for what works in business and what works in teams. So people can just process a lot of information. People who process fast can it's not that they're just going with gut. They really can kind of tabulate everything quickly and get to a conclusion decision. People who are making creative connections, and people who are just street savvy. They kind of see how it would all fit together, who would accept it, how they would accept it, why would it work that way. They got that sort of practical, grounded, how do we get this done thing, often involving who do we get it done with. Okay, so again, I got 6 blind spots. A blind spot in my behavior, a blind spot in my identity. Those are the easiest to see. I've got a harder one to see, which are a blind spot in my traits, in my intellect, or in my emotions. And the last one is a blind spot in my motives. So now let's pick one of those. Let's say we start with, I want to know what it looks like. I don't know if you have identity. You gave me an example of identity. Give me an example of how a motive blind spot would actually work.
Yeah. So this is about self-awareness. This is about being aware of your motives. And sometimes we're very aware. Somebody could say, why are you doing that? Why am I doing this podcast? Why are you doing the podcast? And then, that's kind of, what does it mean for you? There are other times, though, that we're kind of confused about our motives, or we leave a meeting and we're very upset, or we're very gratified. And maybe it's like, why am I feeling so irritated by what so-and-so said in the meeting? And you're kind of puzzled by it. So as another point, emotion is often the way to get it, is the royal road to your motive. Try to figure out what it is. I like, as a place to start, and maybe a place for your listeners to start, is David McClellan, who was an organizational psychologist at Harvard quite a while ago, talked about three motives in business, and as core motives that we all have. And the question is kind of how strong are we in each of these? So one is the motive for power. That's control over our own destiny, often control over other people. Money is a measure often of power. Position is a measure of power. Another one is achievement, getting results, getting something done for our own personal satisfaction. It's not for the pat on the back. It's I really are driven to get to get this done. And the third key motive is affiliation, that kind of emotional support, emotional connection to people. Um, and so I think your listeners could think about 1 to 100. What's my set point on each of those three? And a couple comments I'd make. One is that our motives, when we're under stress, become constricted. I mean, if you think about the fight flight response, survival motive, everything is gone. You don't care about how nice you are. You don't care about, what you're having for dinner. You're focusing on survival. So recognize when you're getting stressed, and wherever your high point is, if your achievement motive is your highest, you're probably going to be over indexing on achievement at that particular time. You're feeling pressured by your boss to get something done by the weekend, by Friday, and it isn't happening, and you're going to be all over your team, maybe more so than you normally would. Maybe that's okay, maybe not. But the real point is be self-aware of what that is.
I see control power showing up in the control on a regular basis, in that somebody has a need for control. The stress is high. Let's say the quality is not as good, or some other team isn't delivering quite the way you wanted, the speed you wanted, the quality you wanted, and the need to control just goes shooting through the roof. And so then people act in very inappropriately controlling ways, trying to get their hands back on something they really want to be certain about, sure about along the way. I see that as undue harshness with a team. I see that as trying to tell a peer how to do their work, or that their work is inadequate. I see that as telling to try the boss sometimes that the boss is not doing the job the boss needs to do. And I think it's all driven from an innate fear of losing control. Is that what you mean by power as an example?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example, a well-rounded example. And so, my advice would be recognize that that is where you go at times when the situation is the way you just described it. And where you should go, in addition to that, being aware of what your own motives are, is start to think about other people's motives, right? I mean, is that controlling behavior the way you're going to get the best results from 3 of the 5 of your team members? Or is this other team member motivated by affiliation? And you'd probably be better off by approaching them in a much more emotionally way that you're based on the relationship, a relationship of equality rather than a relationship of power. And so it's thinking through your motives, awareness, and then the motives of others.
Recognize the other person. Okay, so I see a power as a motive. I see achievement, the drive. I see how that creates a blind spot, because you just get singularly focused on one thing and forget the consequences for that or the cost for doing it or whatever. Affiliation is the one I struggled with. How does this become a blind spot?
Well, I'm sure most of your listeners, and you can probably think about that person that was so social at work that you're like, come on, I need to get back to my desk. Can we just move on with it? That a little bit, I love you, and a little bit of this was just wonderful, but that person's need isn't yet met yet. They need another 5 minutes of your time to talk. And so, if you're that kind of a person, you're probably not focusing on achievement needs or other kind of needs. You're over indexing on your own need for that kind of social connection. And every team needs those people, and they're super important, but obviously that can get overdone. And that's the point of the book. It's the point with the trait chapter is about overdoing your strengths. Do you know when, and I often tell people, think about what your strengths are, what really got you where you are, and then add the modifier TOO in front of it. What happens when you're too organized? What happens in this case what happens when you're too social? So that can kind of, and that's the point is, can you recognize when your strength or when these motives that work for you much of the time are tipping over into a problem?
Yeah, I think that to me, as I look at leadership in general, paying attention to the point at which you become two and fill in the blank on anything. So it's probably something that feels natural and right, and it has a ton of good qualities. It's when does it become too much so that it becomes a negative consequence. All right, so your commentary on affiliation makes me realize another blind spot people have on affiliation. I need to be liked so much that I have trouble with difficult messages, or I want to be nice, or we have a nice culture, and therefore we're not going to actually give the feedback that people need to actually be effective and to develop the way we want them to go. So those are all the negative consequences of being too affiliation oriented. Okay, so we talked a little bit about identity, and can you give me another example about how we should think about, you said it's name tags, and it's the identities we place on ourselves, and it's probably something to do with the order we place those identities. So how do we know if our identity is kind of getting in our way?
Yeah. So identity blind spots are when your identity and your role aren't fully aligned. So it kind of requires two charts, if you will. I mean, an understanding of your identity and that list and the priority, as you said, and then being really clear about what the role requires. I think one way to think about this that I know is familiar to you and all your listeners, identity blind spots often happen at times of change when you're changing the role. I mean, just even going back to my comment about being a parent. I mean, if you're still trying to be, a couple without a kid and you're trying to stay up till, late and have drinks in the evening and, that just doesn't work when you've got a newborn in the bed, in the crib next door. So you have to start to change your behavior to align with your new role and not the old role. And I think about this, that transition and, promotions and so on need to have a whole psychological process. There's the skill development to get into the next role, but there's the psychological process. I think first, before you're in the new role, you need to kind of start to act as if you're in the role, at least in your head, and start to think about what are the role requirements. How does that feel for me? How does that fit for me? What's the new, the first time the subject matter expert gets promoted to become the supervisor, manager of other subject matter experts, they need to let go of being the best engineer or the best marketer. And there should be, as they move into that new role, there should be some grief and the sense of loss. If you like that previous role, and so that's a warning sign. If you're in a new role and you haven't grieved some of the things you loved about the previous role, then you probably haven't fully put your arms around the new role. And that's where people get in trouble. That was an example from my, my story in the very beginning where I hadn't really fully put into the new role.
Right. I see that all the time, as you rightly said, with somebody who's an expert leader that is used to the team coming to them and saying, how do I solve this problem and what do I do about that? And they're the source of all knowledge. And they're lovely leaders and everybody loves working for them and, it's great in so many ways. But when the role requires them to get out of those weeds and to function differently at a different level in the organization, to do different kinds of meetings, they struggle with the identity that they're no longer the expert in this or the problem solver or the go-to person for their team. That's a tough shift, I find, for people.
Yeah, and I like how you mentioned it, that they can become lovely about that. They can still try to solve all the problems. So the team maybe at some level kind of recognizes that they're not growing as much as they'd like to, but they have this wonderful relationship with the supervisor who's, so helpful. And really that person isn't doing their role. Their role is to help other people grow. The role isn't to solve all the problems.
Yeah, I see that one all the time. I also see another identity shift when you are a peer and you suddenly become the boss. And the identity, the affiliation, the relationship I had at one point now has to shift and change. And that's a tough one for people, particularly when there are generational differences in the peer set.
Yeah, and I've heard leaders talk proudly about how they didn't make that change, that how we're still just, everybody is just as good of friends as we were before. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that isn't really the way it's supposed to be. And you shouldn't be going out for drinks every Friday with the team anymore. Maybe once every 2 months, but they should feel a difference and you should feel a difference.
Yeah, yeah. That's it. Feels sad. You're right. There's a loss in that one.
It is.
But at the
Yeah.
same time, I think it's hard to maintain that sort of same level of camaraderie that you had as peers. You can't talk about the same things, for
And
sure.
the other thing is, sometimes you get into that new role and you realize it doesn't fit for you. This isn't who you are. You really do like being that subject matter expert. You do still want to be reading the engineering journals and not the leadership and management journals. And rather than that feel like a failure, it should feel like, hey, I got in the wrong role. And now I realize it, and HR and other people should help me with figuring that out rather than somehow I've become a problem that needs to be solved.
It's true. Although I see lots of times we want you to still be the engineer and to be the leader. And the question is, what proportion of my time where, what kinds of engineering problems, and how do I get out of everything and make sure I'm focused on the ones that matter? It's that balancing again between the two that is so hard to do.
And that's why it's self-awareness. It isn't just a click of you went from one list to a different list of roles. It's really being self-aware of these challenges, just the way you described it, that I need to balance this now, and I need to be saying no sometimes, where I never said no before.
Okay. All right. So I think we get behavior that whatever I'm doing is not working the way it needs to work or not received the way it needs to work. So we want to change that. We've talked about identity in terms of whether my personal identity and the role identity kind of are aligned or not, and the making shifts with that one. We've talked about the traits, the sort of character traits or the personality traits, so the adjectives of ourselves. We've talked about the intellect, the IQ, just this amount of information, the speed of processing, the creativity, and the street smart. Rare that comes all in one person. I think it's much more of awareness of where are you strong, where do you lean, and where do you not lean. So you look for people who have that kind of intellect. All right, let's talk about emotions for a moment. Okay, so EQ. We all know EQ, emotional intelligence, awareness of your own emotions. But you said an interesting phrase at the beginning, and that is understanding how you use emotions. So say more about what you mean by how we should be using emotions.
Yeah, maybe I'll give a little example and then we can unpack it a little bit more. So being emotionally aware is a good thing as a human being. So EQ is just good because it's just a better way for us to have better relationships that are more fulfilling for us and for others. But at work, it's about getting results. Work is about performance. And so the question that I was thinking about is, why is EQ important for getting results? And to me, all of this, as I said earlier, it's about, you are a tool. Your personality is your tool of expressing all that you know about how to lead. And so that includes your emotions. And so you should be able to be deliberate about how you show up with your emotions. And sometimes that means turning them down. Sometimes it might mean turning them up or behaving in some way. So here's one example. I was working with a leader, and she was talking about how she was in a meeting, and she brought up an issue that she thought was really important, and nobody really picked up on it. And the meeting wound around to other topics. Came back a second time, and she brought it up a second time. Nobody really seemed to pick up on it. And I said, how about the next time you go into the meeting? And she did follow this advice. I said, you actually pound the table when you say that. And this is somebody who never, ever does anything like that. And of course, everybody in the room turns their eyes to her and pays attention at that moment. And so that was using her feeling. She was upset and frustrated, but doing it in a way to be deliberate, to get those 5 people to notice. And each of those 5 people then are going to tell 5 more people that Donna pounded the table in the meeting. And kind of the message is she really cares about this. Maybe we need to figure out why or pay attention or get better results. And so that is using your emotions in a very deliberate way. And it requires all those other pieces of EQ, of being aware of how you're feeling, being aware of how other people feel, to be that deliberate.
Yeah. I've seen this happen. I'll give you a concrete example. A leader whose team is not really understanding what they need to deliver or the significance of what they're trying to deliver around a particular project. And so they're not really kind of engaged with it. And frustrated because having tried every tactic you can imagine is not getting there. And had a senior leader sitting in on a team meeting and just kind of said, I'm, in a very firm but not mean way, you're letting me down. We're better than this. I'm expecting you to be better than this. And kind of, little talking to the team. And that was a bold move to show that much negative emotion in front of the effectively your boss. And the boss said to her afterwards, that was exactly what was needed at exactly that moment in time. It's that the emotion was appropriate and it wasn't out of control.
Yeah, and one thing I would say about that is when you decide to do that, less is more. I mean, like, make that stern statement and then let the room respond. Don't the
Keep rating. Yeah.
people try to undo it afterwards a little bit by trying to softening the message, and they lose the impact. So yeah, it's just like do it, and it is a bold move. You're right. There is a bit of oh my gosh, did I go too far or not?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you don't get to use that every day because if you start
Oh
pounding the
no.
table every day, you're going to get a different reputation. But I've also seen it on the positive side. Somebody who's actually quite passionate about a project can't get the idea sold, just keeps trying and trying and trying and trying. But what they were doing was not showing any passion, any commitment, any kind of enthusiasm. And so it's hard to get somebody else excited about it. So it goes both positively and negatively on this one. All right, I want to shift the conversation for a minute. So again, the 6 kind of places to look for blind spots are, is it in your behavior? Is it a mismatch in the identity and the role? Is it something about a trait that you're overusing? Is it an intellect that's missing? So the amount of information, the speed, the creativity, and the street savviness. Is it emotions that you're not aware of, you need to be aware of, or that you need to be more intentional, under control, short time to ratchet the emotion up or even to ratchet the emotion down? And is it the motive? Is there something about what's really driving you that has become too much in that particular situation? Okay, now you said something to me that I found really, really interesting, which has to do with what you think only the CEO can do. I suppose this is true of leader of the business group, but talk to me about your perspective on what is it the CEO really does.
Yeah. So this came from an article by AJ Lafley, who was the CEO of Procter and Gamble, and I think he wrote an article in HBR in early 2000, and that was the title of it. What can only the CEO do? And it was so intriguing that I found myself asking the CEOs that I work with that question, and I would get the kind of deer in the headlights look like, oh my God, I have never really thought about that. It's not about what I can do or what I'm good at, or it's just really that job. And that's true, as you said, of any box on the org chart. If it's a box on the org chart, it means there's something that role has to do, right? So being very clear about what is the requirements of only that role can do, and if somebody else is doing it, then that's probably not the right person, or if it's not being done by that person in that box, then it's not being done. So the CEO, I think of there's 5, and actually I'll mention them, but I've also been working with a company where we've been pulling this down to the next 2 levels. And I've found that the same 5 are holding. They're a little tweaked a little differently, but they all hold. So the CEO, only the CEO can hire their senior team. And I've been involved, and I'm sure you have as well, being brought in to help a new CEO look at the team that's around them and decide who stays and who goes. And this is about knowing themselves and what do they need around them, and knowing the org design that they'd like. So if they've just assumed a role, if they just assume the people around them, then or HR picked people for them, then they're really not doing what only they can do. They can only hire and fire their team. Um, all obviously the strategy, the overall strategy of the company, and obviously they do that with the board and with other teams. But at the end of the day, they own the strategy, and they're going to be retained or bonused or exited based on how well that strategy turns out. So they better really own it and not feel like it's being delegated anywhere else. The key priorities, they're the champion of the key priorities and they're the ones to call the yeses and the no. No, that isn't a priority this year. That's something we definitely need to be doing, but that's next year, or we don't have the resources, or we're allocating resources differently. So they're the ones really in charge of not having scope creep on priorities, not having people being confused about whether they should do A or B. Number three is they own the cult. They should be the champion of the culture. And this doesn't mean that they do culture every day, but all senior leaders or all leaders are in a fishbowl all the time. Everybody's looking at that leader, and the leader's behavior should be consistent with the values and the culture of the company. And they should think about that. Like, I'm going to behave in this certain way because that's the culture of our company, or I'm trying to move the company culture, one way or another. And so I need to be actually deliberate about how I'm behaving and the communication I'm giving out and the message I'm giving to other people about how to behave. So clearly lots of people help with culture, but they need to, CEO needs to really own it and really feel that it's theirs to kind of make decisions about. And then the final one is there are key relationships that only the CEO owns. Some people only want to talk to the CEO, and the CEO should be very clear about, and this is again, I think all these things are true at different layers in the company. Who do I need to talk to and who needs to talk to me? There's 3 key customers I should be talking to, 3 times a year. I know they know they can always pick up the phone and call me, but I should be reaching out to them. I should own those relationships. They shouldn't be delegated to sales or revenue. Clearly the board, investors, media, other kinds of relationships, but it should be a finite list that the CEO should say, here's the 15 people that I own these relationships.
Right. I think these 5 are pretty powerful. Okay. And it's not like you do any of them in solo, because you never do anything solo. But at the final decision, the CEO is the one who makes the go, no go, committed, not committed decision on who's on the senior team and who's not. They may be still in the organization, but they're not on the senior team. On, is this the right strategy or the wrong strategy? And I'm putting my reputation, my backing behind it. Are these priorities clear and consistent, and I'm going to stick with them to see them through? Am I living the culture? Am I hiring on the culture? Am I promoting on the culture? Am I sanctioning people who are not consistent with the culture? You see all sorts of creep on that one, as I'm sure you know. And then who are the key relationships that I need to be in touch with and own? I think you're right, though. If you say, what are the 5 things I need to be doing as a leader? I need to be evaluating my team. Is it what I need or not need to have the feedback they need in one way or another? What's the strategy of our area, and am I truly committed to it? 3, what are my priorities, and are we really making those consistent and clear? Number 4, what's the culture our team is going to operate by, and am I truly living it and championing it? And what's the relationships that I have to own so that our team works effectively? Those are 5 pretty powerful questions for any leader to ask.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously leaders do a lot of other things, but the point is that that 5 is not too many to keep pretty clear in your head. And that each Friday you can say, just kind of tick them off in your head about, how well did I do?
How'd I do?
Did I pay attention to all 5 of these this week?
Yeah, because they will define for you, in effect, what your role really is about. But more importantly, what is it that only you can do? And I think that's, that's a pretty powerful set. I really rather like that. Okay, Marty. So the book again is Blind Spotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. As I said, you've written this for the individual leader in an organization, but I also think rather than saying to a direct report, we have to figure out what's holding you back, how about be a little bold and look at these 6 blind spots and come up with some hypothesis about what might be holding the person back and give them some feedback about that? Seems to me to be a smart direction forward. Behavior, identity, traits, intellect, emotions, and motives. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you, Marty, what's the best way to find you?
Two ways. I have an author website, martindubin.com, where there's more content about this and other information. And then also blindspotting.com, where we, in addition to all of that, we also have created a blind spotting test, a quick 10-minute test that you can pretty much get an idea of what your blind spots, but there is a bit of a catch-22. So the test helps you figure out what maybe your blind spots might be.
All right, fantastic. So a bonus for anybody listening to this, if you check out our YouTube channel at Out of the Comfort Pod, we'll make sure that link to the test, blind spotting, is posted there, as well as on LinkedIn. So Marty, thanks for being a guest today. What a good conversation.
Thank you, Wanda. Really lovely. I appreciate it.
All right, join us next week for another episode of Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone. And please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Any comments or questions you have, outofthecomfortzone.com. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us today. Tune in for another edition next week with Dr. Wanda Wallace on the Voice America Business Channel. Reach outside your comfort zone this week.